Mary, I was just going to ask you, poets can often be prophetic in the way that they see things. And I was at a terrific poetry festival last week in Kerry, and Harry Clifton was speaking, and he was saying, you know, we really have to take on board that we may be moving into an era where our world and our lifestyle is turning nomadic, as it used to be. And I remember sort of sitting there and saying, right, you know, the wild hordes coming across Europe or whatever. But I could see what he meant, that in a way, particularly the rich Western countries who are clinging to a notion of solid borders which will not ever be breached, and this as, you know, something that cannot be discussed, and even the notion of nationhood can surely not stand in face of fellow human beings starving and being reduced to begging for the basic human rights that they deserve. So this global warming and what it's created, and the sort of you know, numbers of people heading towards Europe's borders in the last few years, they're saying something, aren't they? They're saying something about the nation state.
In a way, yes. And there is an awareness at the international level that we need to manage migration much, much better than we do, manage the refugee situation and their right to seek asylum much better than we're doing at the moment. There are two streams of work going on, a global compact on migration and a global compact on refugees. And there is good language in both. And there is an awareness of climate displaced people in the compact on migration. But it's what's happening at the borders that's the problem, whether it's the Mexican border, whether it's the borders in particularly countries of Eastern Europe, whether it's boats that can't even land in Italy, in France, etc. I'm glad that Ireland is taking some from the latest boat, but it's not tolerable that we don't understand our humanity, you know, our Ubuntu, that I am because you are, that link that we all have with each other. I mean, it's and poets do say it better.
Yeah, they can see beyond, they can see around the corner, and that was one of the things that was coming. But, I mean, sometimes what happens with the challenge of climate change is that people say, it's so big that I just turn off. And you had mentioned specific things that all of us can do. Relating that particularly to the sea, to the ocean, what can we do?
Well, I think, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it, plastics brings us immediately because it's so serious now, and the acidification of the ocean is so serious. But maybe I can answer your question in a different way. I was going to tell you privately, but now I'll tell you in full public gaze here in Galway. First time I've said this publicly in Ireland. I am about to do a podcast. I'm doing a podcast. I'm doing it with another Irish woman who's based in New York, whom you might know. She's a comedian called Maeve Higgins.
Yes.
She's quite well known, I think, and she's great fun. So it's actually fun to do it. And we call it Mothers of Invention. And the byline, if you like, is that climate change is a man-made problem and needs a feminist solution. And the reason we're doing it is that it should be right in the forefront of women's thinking and women's organizations politically and every other way. And yet when I attend large gatherings, as I do as a former president, as I do blah, 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 I meet, you know, fellow presidents, prime ministers, ministers, heads of agencies, businesswomen, etc. And we talk about, and it starts with economic empowerment of women, Me Too, violence, harassment, equal pay issues, etc. And then we get on to health, and then we get on to education. And it's quite down the line that we get on to climate change. So what we're doing is we discussed plastics, we discussed health, we discussed food, we discussed climate litigation, we discussed divestment from fossil fuels. And these 5 series will come out at the end of July. I've never done a podcast before. I'm out of my comfort zone. But apparently young people listen to podcasts much more than my age. And the point really is the urgency of getting the message across to the non-climate specialists, to all of us. Because actually, we do need to take this seriously. We do need to make it personal, and we do need to take the steps that can be taken.
Well, we're talking today about the sustainable development of the ocean.
Yeah.
And all morning we've been hearing about, you know, the challenges from Brexit. But we're also talking about flying shellfish halfway around the world.
Yeah.
So there's a challenge there, isn't there, between the sustainable development of the ocean and this talk of blue growth, where we have to take on board that, maybe profit and the expansion of the market is not the first thing.
I've been listening for several years now to a fellow elder, one of the elders brought together by Nelson Mandela, which I'm very honored to be part of. Her name is Ila Bhatt, wonderful Gandhi-like Indian woman. And she founded the Self-Employed Women's Association a long time ago. And it's one of the I think it's the biggest informal trade union in the world. It's got about 2 million members. And she has been talking about the fact that we shouldn't eat anything that's grown or matured or in any way more than 100 miles from where we live, which is an interesting concept, that we should have that sense that food shouldn't have to travel with whatever carbon footprint it brings more than that 100 miles. And I think there's a lot to be said for it.
Yeah, and a lot of the very good chefs actually believe in seasonal food and food that's easily
slow
available.
Food and all that.
Yeah, that's something that we need to take on board. Well, Mary, you're going to stay with us because we're going to hear from 2 other speakers in this session. And our next speaker is José Soares dos Santos, who's a 4th-generation member of one of Portugal's biggest business families. He's now chairman of Oceano Azul Foundation, which is devoted to ocean sustainability, allowing the coexistence of human development and ocean protection. He's Portuguese and very conscious of Portugal's history as a great seafaring nation and the contribution that it can make to a sustainable approach to the ocean. So would you please welcome José Soares dos Santos.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. First of all, let me thank Peter Efferman for the invitation. Thanks to Peter, the expedition that our foundation just funded last week, and his passion about sea mapping. We just discovered a new field of hydrothermal vents in the Azores, which will make a significant difference for the region. So it was great. I was asked to talk about my family and the way we look at business and why we did the foundation. I am 4th generation of a family business. Our turnover last year was 17 billion euros. We employ more than 100,000 people in Portugal, in Colombia, in Brazil, and in Poland. And our core business is food, both manufacturing and distribution. We have more than 4,000 stores around the world. We consider ourselves very fortunate because, of course, we work a lot. I mean, we took 4 generations to reach where we are, but we have access to information. We have access to outstanding people like the ones we are here today. And fortunately, we have capital. So we feel somehow obliged to do something about it. We cannot, as we hear problems, we cannot turn around and pretend that we have nothing to do with it. So some years ago, we started a foundation, the Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, which is basically dedicated to human rights and freedom, because we actually think we have a very serious problem in the world in what concerns equality, human development, and the notion of democracy. So we do a lot of work on that front. Some 4 or 5 years ago, as the other foundation was going through very well, we decided to launch our 2nd citizenship initiative, which is on a sustainable front. And of course, being Portuguese and Portugal having the tradition of to be a maritime nation, it makes completely sense for us to dedicate ourselves to the oceans. In climate was already full of organizations working already, not fully dedicated to the oceans. There wasn't, definitely not in Portugal. So I'm not going to spend time telling you the importance of the oceans. You know already what is the importance of the oceans for the development of the planet. And within the planet, of course, the human being. So we started this foundation, and to show our commitment, we acquired the Lisbon Aquarium. So our total commitment immediately up front was more than 100 million euros on this matter, because we had this feeling of urgency. We cannot take as long as we took in climate change to come up with practical solutions. I still doubt that in climate change we have practical solutions, but in this case we needed very practical solutions in the oceans. And the aquarium is a way for us to demonstrate that we are very serious about this. But we took this over. We cannot. We have this problem. We don't want to be judged as a bad generation. I understand that my father's generation, the issues of environment were not really present in their upbringing. But I think most people in this room cannot claim that they don't know. People in this room cannot say, I was not aware. And most of all, people in this room cannot definitely say, I can't do nothing about it. You can do something about it. And we are a little bit obsessed about this. So we need to do something about it. So we feel it is our duty not only to invest in knowledge and science, but also to make sure that our companies change. And make sure that we demonstrate to everybody that it is possible to have economically viable businesses at the same time we do good for the environment. And we are changing our retail chains in such a way that we can demonstrate that this is possible to do. The foundation made a huge impact in our managers, because the moment they got in contact with the issues, they understood the importance. And we slowly are destroying the main arguments that people use not to act. One of the arguments is we do not have enough data. I wonder how many decisions businessmen and businesswomen take without having enough data. Most of our lives, as we are trained to take decisions without knowing everything we need to know. So most of the time, this is a matter of managing risk for us. And I find very interesting that in what concerns environment, we take the opposite position that we do in business. Because in business, we are trained to minimize risk in our investment, minimize risk in our operations, and minimize risk in our products that we sell to our consumers. But when we talk about impacts in the environment, we seem to forget all what we learned in the last few years. And we seem to always use the same arguments. I don't know enough. So our argument is the opposite. Because we don't know enough, we should be extra cautious in what we do. So I'm going to give you some examples. So for us, plastics, we have already banned plastics for you to take home. Of course, we are now working actively in our food chains to diminish plastics, because plastics will be a very complicated matter to eradicate from our supply chains. But we can dramatically diminish the plastics that go into the sea. That there is no doubt about it. This year, all our operations in Portugal will only buy energy from renewable sources. This will cost us a lot of money. But if we do not show clear leadership as leaders of businesses or as leaders of communities, we are sure that we will not be able to live to our sons and daughters a better world that we receive from my father. And isn't that, I guess most businesses here are somehow family businesses. This is the essence of family businesses. The essence of family business is to leave to the next generation something better than we receive from our fathers. And that means, in the world of today, sustainability. And it's up to us, not to governments We cannot give this to governments. We cannot play always the same card. Someone else will solve the problem for us. It is to the business leaders, to the family leaders, to take the long-term perspective, which is the generation perspective, and to make sure that they can invest and change. And our experience in our business, as we explain this to managers, as they are fathers and mothers, the creativity that we are able to free to find solutions, which before we were not able to confront, it's amazing. We continue to grow at 9 to 10%, and our profits continue to go up. And every year, we are becoming more sustainable, and we are becoming more responsible vis-à-vis the planet that we live on. I hope that these conferences convinces you that it's easy to say yes than to say no. It's more profitable for us and for our future to say yes to new ideas, to say yes to disruptive measures, than to continuously to say it is not possible. Thank you very much for listening to my short presentation.
Thank you, José. This conference has developed a tradition of hearing from Portugal, which of course is a great seafaring nation, and José is just another person in that honourable tradition. Our next speaker is Cathy Sullivan, former Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere of the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. She's had a long career as a distinguished scientist and, yes, wait for it, astronaut. She flew on 3 space shuttle missions, including the 1990 mission that deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. She's now Senior Fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies and Ambassador at Large for the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. So would you please welcome Cathy Sullivan.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with everyone and want to add my thanks to Peter Heffernan. And for all who know the Marine Institute, in particular, my thanks to Helen Bowles, who actually is the reason all these wheels turn and such wonderful events happen. It's a delight to be with you, delightful to be with you again, and so near to my family's roots down in Kerry. I'm really here because every conference like this really needs to have its one token space cadet. And I'm happy to fill that role here today. I come to this topic from a, needless to say, different angle and different perspective than much of what's been spoken about today. I'm trained academically originally as an oceanographer. My specialty was the geology and geophysics of the seafloor. But immediately after completing my PhD, I was picked up by NASA and admitted to the United States Astronaut Corps as a member of the Space Shuttle team. So I have an experience, a view from and a passion for both of the 2 grand frontiers that are the grand physical frontiers of any being that lives on this planet. The grand frontier of space, which is, if you think about it, it's always aspirational. It lifts our eyes to the sky, to the stars, to the skies. It has this almost magically unifying quality to it. We all have the moon over our heads. We all look up at the same stars. The art, even the artwork, be it in literature or in representational arts, is always very uplifting and positive and aspirational, almost completely so. And the sea, on the other hand, think about it, it's the cold, gray, fish-bearing sea of Homer, right? It's a darker, more mysterious, more difficult place. What they have in common is that they are both vast and grand frontiers. They are both underexplored frontiers. They are both very difficult to explore and really get to know. But of the 2, our ocean is actually the harder and the less well-known frontier. It's a true statement that we have better maps of the surface of Mars, and frankly, even the surface of Venus, than we have of the floor of our own oceans. Now, when I was a young girl, 100 or so years ago, but in the early 1960s, growing up in the United States, We had 3 magazines that came to our home regularly. 2 came on a weekly basis and 1 came on a monthly basis. And in the years roughly 1960 to 65, every issue of all 3 of those magazines had side by side the story of the very first explorers of space, the original 7 astronauts in the United States, and stories of visionaries who dreamt of exploring the deep sea, maybe even establishing bases and colonies on the seafloor on the continental shelf. And as I reached my 13th or 14th year, the investment and interest and commitment to exploring and understanding the space frontier soared, pun very much intended, and the reverse didn't happen. Our commitment to our investment in globally, and certainly in my country, to the deep frontier, the blue frontier, it languished. So much so that a popular mystery writer named Clive Cussler exploited the gap, creating a near clone of an American ocean exploration agency, the NASA for the oceans, and a swashbuckling character named Dirk Pitt, who he styled as sort of the courageous underwater explorer to match anything that John Glenn ever did. One remained a fiction for far too long in our exploration. Well, as an oceanographer, why did I choose to go into space? I chose to go into space for the same reason I had chosen to become an oceanographer, to understand this planet and how it works. And after my 15 years and a couple of flights, the passion that reignited in me was to bring that perspective, the extraordinary perspective on this planet that we can get from above, the extraordinary insights as to how the natural systems of our planet work, the oceans and the atmosphere, our ability to take a snapshot of conditions on this planet and really look at what this almost organism is that we live on. How do we bring that perspective, that information, back to Earth? How do we bring it home? How do we make it matter? My phrase for this, José just used a similar line, but my phrase for this has become, how do we gain the knowledge we need and then act on it in a way that ensures that we can live wisely and well on this planet, making insightful decisions, understanding and recognizing the interconnections, not just among the natural systems of our planet, ocean and atmosphere and biota, but also among the social and economic systems that we're more familiar with on a day-to-day basis. All of those systems are directly and intimately interconnected, mostly in ways that none of us really think about or come into contact with on a daily basis. What has inspired me about the theme of this conference, future-proofing our ocean economy, our marine sector, is that phrase, future-proofing. And I think, and again, echoing points that Mrs. Robinson and José have made, the only way I believe that it's right to understand that phrase, future-proofing, has got to be about ensuring that our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren have a viable and vital future living on this planet. That is what the future-proofing must be. It can't be just future-proofing my company. It can't just be future-proofing one sector of an economy. If we're not taking that longer view of future-proofing, we won't be making the kinds of decisions now that will give us the future we all should want. The ocean's wealth that we've talked about so much this morning, Ireland's ocean wealth, any nation's ocean wealth, depends on the ocean's health. And there's only one global ocean. There's not bits we can map the ocean and we can draw administrative lines about who gets to do what where. The planet doesn't know about those lines. The planet doesn't operate by those lines. It's a single ocean we've got to understand as a unity and then understand how we're interacting with it. We spoke this morning about developing the regulations, the skills, and the investments needed to really deliver on the promise of the marine economy for Ireland, and I support those goals. Those are fine. But side by side, and I would argue on equal footing with those, must be supporting and investing in stewardship and a commitment to long-term capital appreciation of the natural resources, just as much as there's a commitment to capital investment and return on investment in a more tactical sense. Yes, we need to map our oceans better, not just the sea floor, by the way, but to better understand the third dimension, the living volume of the ocean, what is where and who lives where, and not just as patches on a two-dimensional map, but to really match that mapping investment with a commitment to knowledge development, to research, so that we understand better than we do now how this system works, which elements really are cornerstone elements that need to be regarded in a different way, which operating limits we really must respect, what rates of use or rates of involvement can the ocean genuinely sustain, and when are we cloaking ourselves in the word sustainable, but actually just rather doing what we want, maybe just trying to do it a little more gently, but not really knowledgeable about what the planet can bear and still be sustainable in the long term. I've been very pleased to hear some of the speakers this morning, Mr. Creed, Mrs. Robinson, echo points along these lines, but it's wonderful to say such things from a podium like this. The important point is, do we go back home? Do we go back to our restaurant? Do we go back to our grocery store? Do we go back to our CEO's office or to our fishing boat? And when we're back there, do we keep those points in mind and really look for ways to live up to them, even if it's a degree or a couple degrees better than we did the day before? I believe, I would say I know, having seen our planet as one single beach ball that we are all crawling around on, we must all each do that if any of us are going to have a future-proofing and a future viable ocean. You know, I will just close by noting something that many have said before, but it's true and worth remembering today. Whoever named this little beach ball that we live on, whoever named it Earth, had it exactly wrong. Google, back when you will remember, created Google Earth. And I was delighted to join a small band of pirates led by Sylvia Earle, who assaulted the Google offices and said, look, you're allowed to call it Google Dirt, but you got no data from the ocean in this little machine you've built, so you're not allowed to call it Google Earth. It's not Google Earth until you've put the ocean in it. The planet should have been named Aqua, and then Google buckled down and did develop the ocean layer. But we must really understand that oceanic layer. It is not only a potential source of wealth, it is not only a potential source of living resource to feed and nourish the billions of people on this planet who depend on it. It is very directly, very really, the source of life for all of us. If there's not a healthy ocean on this planet, there won't be a healthy human society on this planet. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you here today.
Well, just to talk about some of the points that you've all raised. And Kathy, if I could start with you. I mean, you're one of the few people who actually, from outer space, has seen the great blue of the ocean. Does it strike you that we don't at all invest the same amount of money in sea exploration as we have in space exploration?
It does strike me. And I watched with some dismay as a young girl as I saw the two investment curves diverge. I was equally fascinated in both. Maybe, frankly, a bit more fascinated in the underwater habitats that were dreamt of back then. And that might have been because the artists and people representing them back in the early 60s showed a natural cross-section of society, perhaps living in those habitats, where it was only 7 particular men at the moment that were exploring space. So yes, I think the underinvestment in developing knowledge and exploring our ocean has been regrettable for decades. My biggest hope for the push towards blue economy is that perhaps that will help trigger not just the focus on the extractive and the usage investments, but also on that underpinning knowledge development. I would add, however, an endorsement for the point that José made. I've run companies, I serve on corporate boards. José's point about this discrepancy between when I'm making a business decision with lots of variables and very imperfect information, you make the decision anyway. You make the best one you can and you adjust and you go forward. And it is a very tragic irony that when it comes to something like the earth science impacts that businesses face, then they go the other way and say, oh, well, we don't have completely perfect knowledge, so you can't expect me to do a thing yet.
But just to pick up on something you were saying, that the ocean is one. You can't divide it off. It doesn't have walls, which would indicate, obviously, that anything we do or anything we want to do about the ocean involves international cooperation. It's absolutely central to achieving anything. Are you pessimistic in the political atmosphere that you are facing in the States right now of rowing back on that commitment?
You know, I dislike the political climate of my own country right now, but I'm actually sort of pessimistic globally. There's a resurgence of populism and stiffening borders. I'm not against proper measures of sovereignty and security, but there's a viciousness and a stridency to it that is of longer duration than my country's current president and more systemic. So I don't disagree with I'd echo your points, but I think we make a mistake if we put too much of it on just one man as the point and the source of it. We're in some systemic becoming of something else globally that I certainly don't understand, that is making all these challenges more difficult, certainly.
José, coming to some of the things that you were talking about, in terms of what, as a business, your family were ready to do, and that you were ready sometimes to take the decision and take the risk, perhaps, that something might or mightn't work. But one of the things, when you were talking to me last night, that you said you do, for instance, is that in your stores, you're no longer going to stock or to sell wild fish.
We are preparing ourselves to make that statement, yes.
Yeah. Which is pretty drastic. I mean, basically you're saying that this whole tradition of wild fishing that, for instance, happens the whole way down this west coast in this country has to end because there is some way we have to stop exploiting already overexploited fisheries.
So let me explain a little bit our business. So we are on the low-cost side, which usually it's called discounters. So we do usually very low prices. So as you understand, it is a very hard business, so we need to work a lot. But the point is, we feel the pressure now from consumers. So consumers are increasingly aware of they need to do something about it, and they do not expect any more governments to do something about it because there is overall disbelief in governments around the world. So consumers turn to companies. And of course, they turn to companies which they have direct deals with. And of course, a food retailer, we contact them every week, 3 to 4 times a week, because we are expert in perishable foods. And you feel that pressure, then you have to respond to that pressure. So slowly, the whole company is getting ready to stop wild catch. And don't think that we are lyrics or poets, because we're not. We do 17 billion, and we need to work every day at those 17 billion. We actually sell already very little wild catch. Most of the fish we sell in our stores come from fish farming, because this is what consumers are willing to pay. Wild catches are already very expensive. So only a few stores now sell this. And then we are getting ready to take the final decisions. But can I just say something in what you comment? There is a huge difference between investing on land and investing on sea. So we've spent the last 150 years optimizing costs on land. So substitution technologies which are environmentally friendly are always a very difficult business decision, but not on the oceans. We have no doubts that the oceans in the future will be a main area of investments. This is why you see the discrepancy in investments. It's just starting now, the technologies that allow us to go in. So as business leaders, we better get in with the right technologies which are already sustainable, because then we will spend the next 100 years optimizing sustainable technologies and not doing the same mistake, not repeating history, where we developed and lowered the costs of exploration to such a point that substitution technologies will become very difficult. And I think when I am here in this room, and when I'm looking at Ireland and Irish people, which have the same tradition to the oceans as the Portuguese, early explorers, earliest adventures, somehow we have the responsibility to show this leadership. So we better adopt these technologies as earlier as possible. And there are a couple of reasons for it. And one of them is leadership. Because the companies that will do this, they will do better in the future. We have no doubts that consumers are now pushing this very hard for us to sell the products which are sustainable. It started with labeling. Consumers are demanding more and more labeling. Yeah. As they demand more labeling, they are now demanding origin. After they demand origin, they will ask, is there pain involved? Is there suffering involved? Is this sustainable? So if we take the leadership, we believe we will be better off than if we don't take leadership.
Mary, you wanted to come in.
I don't want to cut Olivia out of this, but I also wanted to ask you a question, and that is, I like the way you were talking about business leadership, and I spend quite a lot of time encouraging business leaders to take more leadership, so music to my ears. But then you said something, you said we are only going to use renewable energy, and that costs us a lot. Why? That shouldn't be.
Well, it costs us a lot, so this year...
Portugal's fault.
Yes,
yeah.
that will cost us, our companies, a lot. That will cost us our energy bill more 1 billion than we are paying currently.
But solar energy and wind energy, they're becoming cheaper.
But currently it will cost us $1 billion more.
Yeah, and that, I think, is the big mistake at the moment. I mean, we shouldn't have renewable energy costing more because we need to move very rapidly out of the fossil fuels. I mean, can you do something about that as a business leader and say it's not fair that I have to pay more?
Well, I can say that. It's not fair that we are paying more, but we still pay more. So instead of doing this, what we are launching is something which we find more interesting. Companies have to produce savings in energy that compensate for the billion. So this is a double win. You just have to play with time. So when the energy will come down, cost of energy will come down, for us we will win twice.
Yeah.
Cheaper, and we will spend less energy in our operations.
José, and it's something we're going to be talking about in a session actually later on about renewable energy and prices coming down. But just to say something, José, that there are roles that everybody can play. The sort of role perhaps that business can play is that sometimes you can go ahead and do something quicker, perhaps, say, than a government or a state agency could. And I'm thinking, for instance, of, one of the campaigns you've taken on is to stop the endangered seahorse species being harvested for aphrodisiac purposes, I think, by elderly Japanese gentlemen and maybe not so elderly Japanese gentlemen. But that there are some times that you can step in and do something without having to go through 1,000 committees, and that perhaps that's an area that business and the private sector can play if it's wont to do so, if it's ready to do so. It is not possible to deal with the oceans, which are one. Geography is a human concept. It's not a nature concept, but it's a human concept. We cannot deal with this without governments, because governments are the ultimate owners of land and sea, and they represent the people. Private companies do not represent the people. Private companies represent something which they define themselves. But we find very interesting the cooperation with governments and institutes, because the way governments and institutes are set up, sometimes they are not able to act as fast as private entities. So every time we sit up with the Portuguese government and we are able to find common areas of interest, we can help. And we can help not to do new things, but to do them faster. Just before I turn the conversation back to the wider notion of climate change, can I just put a quick point again to you, José? The business of MPAs, marine protected areas, which I gather is something that you're very much in favour of.
Yes.
And our government have considered it or thinking about it, but we still, as far as I know, have no marine protected area declared. Do you think a network of such MPAs is an essential part of beginning to protect the ocean?
I'm going to tell the position which I said to the government of Azores just 2 or 3 days ago. You should protect everything. There are no discussion about it. You don't know, you protect. And then you free areas. I find strange this conversation of 3% protection and 4% protection. What is this? We don't know 95% of the ocean. So protect 95% of the ocean. As we know, unprotect. In Azores, they have these very strange things. They have 600 fishing licenses. They have 4% of marine protected areas in Azores, and the fish is coming down to protect 600 licenses. It makes no sense when we know today from other marine protected areas that if we take the effort to protect them, in 5 to 7 years, we have a fundamental increase in stocks, we have more profits coming out of the fisheries, and we have more fish. I don't understand why we don't protect more. It's just a question of let's have a conversation, let's talk, let's see what we need to do in intermediate steps to lessen the pain and to make sure that in 5 years it is better. Let me give you an argument that National Geographic magazine gave us in our scientific expedition. You better protect when it's not destroyed, because the recovery is much faster. Yeah. Biggest the degradation, bigger the pain. So protect in advance, please.
Well, it's there. Kathy, the whole business, because I know José has done in his foundation a lot of work in terms of education, and that's an important part of what they do. How does one sell to people the realization that things are happening now in the ocean that may mean that their children and their grandchildren's lives will be worse than theirs is?
It can be a very hard thing. I mean, the percentage of humanity that lives near the ocean continues to grow, but all of us who've traveled even to remote island states, you ironically find very often that people who live right there on the shore of Fiji, they know the ocean as the thing they go out on and fish, but many of them don't know the ocean in the way that it really works. They don't dive, they don't see, they see the postcard surface of it and the fish they pull out of it, but not really the ocean writ large. I think events like Seafest that will happen here over the weekend play a role. I think certainly the media channels that are available nowadays, at least to reach people coming up in the developed world, can be very helpful, whether it's National Geographic or the Blue Planet series. I do subscribe to the view that to the degree you can, strike some chord of passion that leaves an ember of curiosity burning in someone, whether they end up in the science field or the business field or in government. That sets up a predilection towards investing in understanding and protecting the oceans. But the demand function for resources from the ocean, whether it's energy or fish or marine transportation, the demand function is huge. It's hundreds of millions of people, billions of people. And the knowledge cross-section is very, very, very thin. So it's a bit of an uphill battle.
Mary, this country is actually quite a big country when you take our seabed into account, as Peter Heffernan keeps on pointing out to me. And of course, in Portugal's case, they have even a bigger seabed, and so they're even richer in those terms. So we're not that small when it comes to taking our sea territory into account. What role do you think that we here can play in terms of finding a sustainable approach to the blue economy, to the sea economy?
Well, more conferences like this will help. There's no doubt about that. So more power to Peter and his colleagues. But I do think that, as I mentioned, at the international level, there is now an awareness. And Fiji, pushed hard for that international conference in 2017. And many countries realized that call to action is something that has to be taken seriously. So that's beginning to be. I think that Ireland can play, quite a strong role in reinforcing that call to action internationally, but also what we do nationally. I'm not an expert on protection zones, but it does worry me that we don't have any protection zones if we don't. I mean, that seems strange. I mean, that's something that I think we should definitely consider.
Right.
And I think, the reality is, when we were discussing the Global Compact on Migration, at the beginning of it, when the initiative was launched, the then head of the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, gave a figure that I think surprised a lot of people, that 75 million people live a meter or less from the sea. A meter or less. And therefore, 75 million people, if there's a sea level rise, are at risk of displacement. And we know that there will be sea level rise. It's how much is the question. So,
On your point about Kiribati,
Yeah.
the trigger will not actually be that water's now in your living room. The trigger will be there's no fresh water supply.
yeah.
That's really what will start the migration wave.
Exactly.
And even in developed places like Florida, Florida's a limestone peninsula, very low-lying, very highly developed, economically developed coastline. They're being hit from 6 different sides. They get hit from storms of greater impact from the ocean, partly higher sea level, partly more intense storms. They get hit on the intercoastal channels with the tide surge, and they're getting hit through the back door with saltwater intrusion into their sewage and plumbing systems as well as their water systems.
Yeah, and in fact, this very heat wave we're having at the moment, I find a bit sinister, to be quite frank. We haven't had heat like this in '76, and only a few months ago we had snow and ice, and it's quite extraordinary.
But we're a resilient country. We have lots of ways of coping.
We do.
The tragedy is this is happening. I've just come back from Malawi, and in Malawi they have a very bad drought. They have a very rapidly growing population. They've had flooding in other parts of the country, and they don't have the wherewithal to cope with this. That's the sad thing.
So are there things that we can do by maybe working with the least developed countries, choosing particular small nations perhaps to work with, and to help prepare or protect them from the effect of climate change?
Irish Aid is doing very good work, particularly with the African countries and Vietnam that we work with. And actually at the meeting I was at in Malawi, there were representatives of what Irish Aid is doing in different countries. They were all gathered in Malawi for this conference, which was on community-based adaptation to climate change. And
But I mean, to take something particular, the way when you can particularize something and put people in it and make it personal, that people will be ready to help. They'll take ownership, to use that awful phrase, of doing something. That maybe there are small island states that we could particularly associate ourselves with and help.
There is an opportunity with the Caribbean. The terrible hurricanes that struck the Caribbean countries. There's a Caribbean accelerator idea, which Ireland is supportive of. Ireland, in the World Bank, shares a governor with the Caribbean and Canada. And there's a lot of support. The World Bank is trying to support that the recovery of Caribbean islands will be based on clean energy. And they have a terrible problem of diesel, and it's all imported and it costs a lot, and etc. So if the recovery could be, and Ireland is actually part of that accelerator momentum. So that's at least something. And if the Caribbean islands do it, then the Pacific islands will learn and do it. I mean, there'll be a peer pressure. I mean, one of the things, I had the privilege of being at a ministerial conference of the least developed countries before the most recent conference on climate. They just asked me to come. It was in Addis Ababa. And these were, Ethiopia itself, Malawi that I was in recently, but also Nepal, Bangladesh, but all the small island states, basically, the developing small island states. And the one thing that absolutely struck me, and I wasn't expecting it, was their ambition. They are all ambitious. They all have nationally determined contributions to climate change, which says what they're going to do, and they all want to go renewable energy. The problem is they don't have the technology, they don't have the skills, they don't have the investment. Why do we not do more to help? That would be a very big question. It wouldn't be a great deal of money.
A quick question then to all three of you, and I'll start with you, Mary. The Paris Agreement and the targets that were set there, were they too ambitious? Have we any chance of reaching them?
Paris was a wonderful conference, and it was a very fair conference. Even there's a fairness in those goals of wanting to stay well below 2 degrees of warming and work for 1.5, because above 1.5, Kiribati is gone. Yeah. So that's the fairness of recognizing that we need very tough targets. Unfortunately, it's not very strong or enforceable, and it is not being implemented robustly enough. And it didn't help that at the federal level, the United States pulled out. It does help that below the federal level, there's this wonderful coalition called We Are Still In, of states, business very notably, civil society, philanthropy, universities, etc. And there'll be a big conference in California in September that I'll be at, organized by Jerry Brown, the governor. And that will be a moment to take stock of what we need to do more, including Ireland, of course. We are a laggard on climate change. Yes, that's our Taoiseach's description. Yes. And that is not good for a country that cares so much about developing countries, that cares so much about the ocean that we have the privilege of being an island in. And, we need to do more.
Second last on carbon emissions, I think, was the measurement.
That was a depressing study.
Depressing. Kathy, in terms of the Paris Agreement and the ambitious targets set, are you optimistic or pessimistic that we'll get there?
I have to say I'm feeling more pessimistic than optimistic. And I was at the Paris conference and felt very much buoyed, despite the problems that Mary cites. It didn't have a lot of teeth. But to get that number of countries coming together with independently determined contributions and a degree of some at least peer pressure, self-mechanism, was such a better step than had been achieved before. So I do naturally tend to be a glass half full person, and I was pleased about that. But there hasn't been the kind of forceful peer pressure following up. The implementation is lagging. I'm quite disappointed with our president's decision to pull out. Very disappointed with the way the accord was represented domestically. It was represented as obligations forced upon the United States, which was just an utter untruth. So that's got me feeling a bit down right now. But Mary has stated very well, there's a lot of good grassroots effort. And in the United States, and frankly, the rubber hits the road at the NGO, the civil society, and the state level in the United States. Yes. So to the degree that various states and the economically significant ones like California and cities, the coalition of mayors in the United States that just has a stake in the soundness moving forward, is tremendous. And they are the market makers in our country. They're the ones making the investment and other decisions that will bring business along.
Okay, José, are you pessimistic or optimistic about the target set in the Paris Agreement?
Well, it doesn't make much of a difference if I'm pessimistic or optimistic. We will end up paying anyway, so we better do something about it. I was at Paris, and I had dinner with some of the island states. And what you said a moment ago, when they start planning these migrations, where they leave their land and they leave their debt and they leave their traditions to move, and you hear this from their voice and they are calm about it. You really, when you listen to this, you say, hey, you need to do something about it. I have a different perspective. Governments are now distracted. You look around the world, all these debates, which you don't really understand why they are debating and insulting each other. So we better do something, because I am sure one thing, the bill will end up in our desks. Okay. So I just want to say something about Ireland. You should think about Ireland not as a two-dimensional country, because the oceans brings the dimension of depth. It produces value all the way down. And by the way, people in this room that deal with the ocean understand this better than everybody else. So invest, because there is a fortune in that column waiting to be explored. And the only people that really understand how to deal with the ocean is people that currently have business with the ocean. So it is a fantastic way of investing in a sustainable way.
Okay. Mary, you wanted to make a last word before we wind up?
And maybe it's just to build on exactly what you said, but it's also to take the question, are you optimistic or pessimistic? Because I was on a stage in New York a few years ago with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and we were in front of a social good conference, it was called, which was young people on their iPads and their phones, all tweeting social media. So you get a big response from this because they're all tweeting. And when Archbishop Tutu is in front of young people, he just loves them and his arms are going all over the place. And we were being moderated by an American journalist. And she said, rather sharply, she said, Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist? And he looked at her and he kind of shook his head and he said, oh no, dearie, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope. And that is an expression that has stayed with me. We all have to be prisoners of hope, because if you are, you talked about the glass half full, actually you have to be prepared to see not half full, but there's something in the glass and work on it. And that's because if you can talk about climate change, and I know this from experience, in a way where everybody just shakes their head in dismay and says, there's nothing I can do, we're finished, we're gone, it's all over, the world is all over. I mean, it sounds like that sometimes when you talk about the threat of climate change. Whereas if you're a prisoner of hope, you actually see there is something we can and actually we must do, because we must secure that future for our children and grandchildren that you also mentioned. And therefore, I mean, we're human beings, we're hopefully reasonably sensible people, and therefore we have to be not optimistic or pessimistic, but prisoners of hope.
As Obama said, is Federling. Thank you very much to our panel. Well done.